What if the Pascagoula alien abduction was real? On the night of October 11th, 1973, two men drove a small skiff out onto the Pascagoula River, just upstream from the old Shaupeneit-Cawley-Davis shipyard. The river is brown and slow. The two men were Charles Hickson, 45, a foreman at the shipyard, and Calvin Parker, 19, a deckhand. They had gone fishing after the day shift. Around 7 p.m., as they were lifting their lines, a blue light appeared over the water. The light was maybe 75 feet out. The light had a shape behind it. The shape was a craft. The craft was hovering about 3 feet above the surface of the river. The craft had no wings. The craft had no lights other than the blue light underneath. 3 figures emerged from the craft. The figures floated across the gap between the craft and the boat. They did not walk. They floated, feet first, like robots. They had no visible necks. Their heads were pointed. Their arms were long. Their hands were shaped like claws. Hickson tried to reach for a pistol in his tackle box. He could not move. The figures lifted him out of the boat and carried him into the craft. The craft smelled like burning sulfur. They laid him on a table and ran an eye-shaped device over his body. They brought Parker in next and did the same to him. Then they put both men back. The men did not drive straight home. They drove to the Pascagoula Police Department. Calvin Parker was shaking so hard he could not light a cigarette. Hickson told the desk officer what had happened. The officer did not believe them at first. He then believed them. Sheriff's Deputy Fred Reese was the first official to interview the men. Reese took them to a room at the sheriff's office and listened to the story. He could not find a flaw in it. He could not find a reason to disbelieve them. He watched Hickson, a hard man with 40 years of fishing on the river, with a veteran's calm, sit in a chair and shake. Reese called the local paper. The Mississippi Press ran the story the next morning, October 12, 1973. The story named the witnesses, the location, and the craft. The story said the men had been taken aboard the craft and examined. The wire services picked it up the same day. By October 13th, the Pascagoula abduction was on the front page of papers across the country. Within a week, a high school history teacher named Tom Huntley, who had been running a small UFO investigation network out of Gulfport, drove to Pascagoula to interview the men. Huntley was a local skeptic. He had been debunking UFO reports for years. He spent 4 hours with Hickson and Parker. He came out a believer. A year later, Huntley published a book about the case. He would spend the rest of his life defending the men he had interviewed that week. By the end of October 1973, the men had been interviewed by the Pascagoula Police Department, the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, the Mississippi Press, several national wire services, and a small number of independent UFO investigators. The most important of those investigators was a man named James Harder. Harder was a professor of engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. He was also the director of research for APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, one of the 2 largest civilian UFO groups in the country at the time. APRO had been investigating UFO cases since 1952. APRO was, in the words of one of its later directors, a group that prided itself on being difficult to fool. Harder flew to Mississippi on his own money. He arrived in Pascagoula on October 31st, 1973, 3 weeks after the encounter. He had with him a polygraph machine. He tested Hickson first. The test ran for 90 minutes. The questions covered the encounter in detail. Where were you standing? What did you see over the water? How did the figures move across the gap? What did the figures do to your body once you were inside? Was there any lasting pain after the examination? Did the figures frighten you once you were on the table? And finally, the question that every polygraph ends with, and the question that broke the case open: were you making any of this up? Hickson passed. The polygraph showed no deception. Harder tested Parker the next day. Parker was more distressed. He cried several times during the test. He had not been the same since October 11th. Harder's conclusion, published in the APRO Bulletin in November, was that both men believed what they were saying, and that the polygraph results were consistent with the account. Joe Foster, the APRO investigator in Mississippi who had organized the harder tests, wrote a separate report. Foster was a Mississippi native. He grew up around the Pascagoula River, working summers on shrimp boats. He spent 10 years investigating UFO reports in the state, driving from one small town to the next with a tape recorder and a camera. He had never, in his own words, seen a case as strong as this one. The Air Force took notice. The nearest military installation with UFO investigation responsibility was Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, about 30 miles west of Pascagoula along the Gulf Coast. Keesler was a major training base. It was also the home of a small unit tasked with tracking UFO reports in the southeastern United States. The man who took the call from the Jackson County Sheriff's Office was Major Donald Keyhoe, a base intelligence officer. Keyhoe drove to Pascagoula on October 13th, 2 days after the encounter. He interviewed the men for 4 hours. He also interviewed the sheriff's deputy. He wrote a 3-page classified memo and sent it up the chain of command. The memo surfaced decades later through the Freedom of Information Act. The memo is the most important primary document from the official side of the case. It is dated October 17, 1973. It is addressed to the base commander, Dr. Robert Naquin. It describes the encounter in detail. It includes the polygraph results. It includes a preliminary assessment that the men are credible. Naquin, however, did not agree. Naquin's official reply, dated January 8, 1974, concludes that the men had experienced a mass hallucinatory episode brought on by exhaustion and a recently consumed meal of fried catfish. Naquin did not interview the men himself. He did not speak to James Harder. He did not visit the boat dock. He based his conclusion on a review of the Keyhoe memo alone. The reply was the final word from the Air Force. The Pascagoula case was officially closed. The men were not told the case was closed. They found out from the press in February, when the Mississippi press reported the Air Force conclusion. For years, skeptics argued that the Pascagoula case was a single isolated event. The implication was that a single isolated event could not be trusted because 2 men fishing after a long day on a slow river at night could easily mistake reflections, barges, or even a flock of herons for something stranger. The record does not support the isolated event claim. On the same night, October 11, 1973, at approximately the same time, a Mississippi Highway Patrol officer named Calvin Clements was on patrol on the east bank of the Pascagoula River. At the Highway 90 bridge, less than a mile upstream from the boat dock where Hickson and Parker were fishing, Clements saw a bright blue light over the river. The light was stationary. The light did not move for several minutes. The light then accelerated vertically and disappeared. Clements filed a report. On the same night, a young woman in Moss Point, on the western bank, was in her backyard with her younger brother. They saw a blue light pass low over their neighborhood. The light was silent. The light did not have navigation lights. The light was moving from east to west, from the direction of the river, at a speed that did not match any aircraft the woman had seen. In the days after the Hickson-Parker encounter, several more residents of Moss Point and Escatawpa came forward with similar reports. Most of them had not reported at the time because they did not know there was a UFO flap in progress. In the weeks that followed, more reports came in. A truck driver on Interstate 10, 20 miles north, a shrimp boat captain in the Gulf, a family in Hurley, a couple in Grand Bay, Alabama. The reports were not identical, but they were consistent. Blue light, no sound, low altitude, October 11, 1973, the Pascagoula River Valley. The case was not isolated. The case was part of a wave. Calvin Parker was the harder of the 2 men to find in the years after the encounter. He went home. He went back to work. He tried to put the night out of his mind. For more than a decade, he would not give interviews. He would not let investigators come to his house. he would not appear on television. Hickson, by contrast, became a kind of one-man publicist for the case. He accepted every invitation he could find, did the talk show circuit in Houston, in Las Vegas, in Los Angeles, and walked the conference floor at the National UFO Conference in Tucson for 3 years running. He sat with Art Bell for a 4-hour session in 1996 that is still archived on the Coast to Coast website. He wrote a book, UFO Contact, at Pascagoula in 1983. He ran a small UFO museum out of his garage. He kept a scale model of the craft he claimed to have been taken aboard. Hickson died in 2011 at the age of 80. The night of October 11th, 1973, was the defining event of his life. Parker resurfaced in the late 2000 teens. He was in his 60s. He had not given an on-camera interview in more than 40 years. He agreed to one in 2018 for a Fox 8 documentary out of New Orleans. The documentary was picked up nationally. Parker told his story, slowly, in his own voice, for the first time in public. In 2023, on the 50th anniversary, Parker published his own book. The book, Pascagoula, the story continues, is the most detailed account of the encounter ever written. The book opens with Parker's account of the moment he lost consciousness on the craft, the cold he felt, the ringing in his ears, the way he came back to himself on the floor of the skiff. The book then walks through his account of the eye-shaped device, the way it moved over his chest and his legs, the way it never quite touched him. The book also prints, in full, the things he told the sheriff that he had not told anyone else. The book sold modestly. It was reviewed in the local papers. It was not reviewed in the national papers. It did not need to be. It was the only place in the public record where Calvin Parker's voice, in Calvin Parker's words, told the story. October 11th, 2026, will be the 53rd anniversary of the encounter. Pascagoula has changed. The Shaupeneit-Cawley-Davis shipyard is gone. The boat dock is gone. The river is the same. The river is brown and slow. The Highway 90 bridge is the same. The East Bank is the same. The neighborhood is the same. Calvin Parker, 72, is still alive. He lives in a small town outside Mobile, Alabama. He still does not give interviews, except to the small number of researchers he has come to trust over the years. He attends the annual anniversary gathering at the boat dock, when there is one, but he does not speak. The Mississippi Press, which broke the story on October 12, 1973, ran a feature in October 2025 marking the 52nd anniversary. The feature interviewed Parker. The feature also interviewed Joe Foster, the APRO investigator, who is now in his 80s. Foster still believes the men. The Fox 8 documentary was re-released in 2026 on the Fox 8 streaming service and on YouTube. The documentary has been viewed more than 1 million times. Most of the views are new. Most of the viewers are too young to remember the original broadcast. The Pascagoula case has, like the river, kept moving. Skeptics have tried to debunk it and failed. Skeptics have tried to explain it as swamp gas, as a flock of herons, as a top-secret military craft, and as a shared psychotic episode between two men who barely knew each other. None of those explanations have held up. The case is still in the files at the Jackson County Sheriff's Office, in the APRO archive in Tucson, and in the Keesler Air Force Base declassified record. The encounter is still retold every October, in the local paper, on the local radio stations, in the back rooms of the high schools, in the fishing camps, in the churches. The case is the longest-running open abduction case in the American South. Here is what the record contains. 2 men, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker, who fished the Pascagoula River on the night of October 11, 1973, and who reported, within hours, that they had been taken aboard a craft. A sheriff's deputy, Fred Reese, who believed them. A polygraph expert, James Harder, who tested them and concluded they were telling the truth. A Mississippi Highway Patrol officer, Calvin Clements, who saw a blue light over the river the same night. A young woman in Moss Point who saw the same light. An APRO investigator, Joe Foster, who spent 10 years on the case and never wavered. An Air Force memo, written by Major Donald Keyhoe, that concluded the men were credible. An Air Force reply, written by Dr. Robert Naquin 3 months later, that concluded the men had hallucinated. 5 decades of consistent witness testimony. 1 book by Hickson in 1983. 1 book by Parker in 2023. 1 Fox 8 documentary in 2018. Re-released in 2026. Here is what the record does not contain. A photograph. A piece of the craft. A body. A specimen. A clear scientific explanation for the night. A second sighting, by the same 2 men, of the same craft, in the 53 years since. If you got to the end, you are exactly the kind of person this channel is made for. Subscribe now and watch to the end for your daily dose of What If It's Real. What if the Pascagoula alien abduction was real? What if the blue light on the river, the clawed figures, the smell of sulfur, the eye-shaped device, the 2 hours of lost time were not a hallucination, not a hoax, not a fish story told too many times, but a record of something that actually happened to 2 men on a brown river in Mississippi on a Thursday night in October, 53 years ago? And what if the question is not whether the abduction was real, but what the figures wanted, and why they came back to the same river year after year until the men who saw them were gone?